We did our two papers on the issue of drug criminalization in America. And so one stance that my sources when researching was that the idea of the government getting involved in criminalizing these drugs goes against the idea of a republic, which is essential to the American system of government, where people are free without the government intruding into their lives.
And many of my sources were of the opinion that while this does undermine the basic freedoms of American people, the criminal activity of drug abusers undermines the basic freedoms of citizens. And if infringing upon the rights of drug abusers means protecting the citizens that behave and act innocently, then it's well worth it.
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting stance that most of my sources did not take. But one thing that I'm not sure, based on my sources, that the government involvement would actually allow these people to have freedom. Because if we look at in the historical context, in the 1930s, alcohol was prohibited, and instead of decreasing the amount of alcohol consumption, the amount of alcohol consumption actually rose, and along with crime and other things. So yeah, that's fine.
So yeah, my sources definitely failed to acknowledge that because that's very true, and it's widely understood that the alcohol prohibition movement contributed to governmental mistrust and actually an increased consumption of the prohibited substance. But my sources seem to take the opinion that the harmful psychoactive elements and the detrimental psychological effects, they trump the possibility of drug prohibition taking the same course that alcohol prohibition did.
Yeah, that's a very good point. My sources completely fail to acknowledge the actual psychological effects of drug users. They focused on broader historical concepts, and also mainly just about the punishments, the amount of people being incarcerated, and focusing on that instead of the actual effects of the drugs. So that is definitely a weakness in my sources.
So just to clarify, your sources were more focused on how harsh the punishment is and how this is an infringement upon the basic rights of us.
Right.
So yeah, my sources stand quite opposite to that, and they believe that the punishment is not harsh enough. They think that individuals almost never sober up unless they face jail time. And they think the threat of possibly going to jail is motivation enough for individuals to sober up and abandon their drug addiction habits. And they think that having this threat is essential to maintaining a relatively sober society.
I think that's a very good point. And I think that also many of my sources would agree that there are a lot of people who aren't necessarily being punished that hard for their crimes, but this is when they bring in a sort of a racial element. They found that blacks and Latinos are facing much harsher and more severe punishments. So in some ways, the war on drugs has turned into a war on race.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I think my sources purposely avoid the racial aspect of this argument because they understand that it's a weakness to their own, and that is against drugs.
Okay.
So now to break down the discussion, my opinions focused on the individual effects of drugs within the mind and the body, and how these can be manifested or can translate poorly into society. And they also focused on the micro occurrences and the actual ways that an individual drug abuser can detrimentally affect the society.
Yeah, and then most of my sources focus on more broad historical concepts. The historical trends. They overlooked the individual impacts on drugs, but they looked at they more looked at the historical concepts like alcohol prohibition and the massive amounts of people behind bars to analyze that and make a claim about it.
Yeah. So I think definitely a weakness of my argument is that they failed to acknowledge the possibility that banning drugs would have the same effects, the same societal effects that banning alcohol did. And this also kind of brings in their bias, which is more of a Republican right-wing bias that opposes drug legalization, lobbies of the libertarian and more left-wing political platforms.
Right, and that's another one of my weaknesses in my sources, was that they did not look at the individual effects of drugs. They didn't analyze that effect as well on the individual and on the society, as well as Graham's sources did. But they did also have some bias, I'd say, towards the idea of the republic, where a government doesn't interfere with people's choices. So in a way, that's also more of a right-wing kind of trait.
All right.